Having nearly finished the Xenosaga trilogy, I'd say Xenosaga 1 is a good enough first entry for the series, while Episode 2 was pretty meh all around with some pretty frustrating aspects to its gameplay. Thankfully for me though, you guys let me know in Episode 1's video that Episode 3 is easily considered the best in the series. From what I've also heard, it's apparently so good the first two games are worth playing just for this one, and that has me pretty excited coming off of 2. Since we're at the end though, I have to wonder, will this game be a more satisfying conclusion than what Xenoblade 3 was for me? My feelings on that game are pretty complicated, and despite being objectively a great game, I can't say I left it even close to satisfied. Only one way to find out for sure if Xenosaga suffers the same fate for me. Time to finish off this series with Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra. And for once, I don't need to apologize, because I'm actually certain I nailed that pronunciation. This is it, the final part of the saga. It's time to get started on this epic conclusion right after some homework. See, because Xenosaga was cut down from 6 parts to 3, unfortunately it had to take the Kingdom Hearts route and tell 2 stories from 2 separate mediums, with those being Pied Piper and The Missing Years. One of you actually pointed out the existence of the latter to me in the comments for the first video, so shoutouts to Gukanzu for letting me know this existed. The former will be more important later, but for right now, The Missing Years will be what's relevant. To make a long story short, during an encounter with an evil Gnosis summoning priest named Grimoire, Shion, Jin, and Cosmos discovered that the Unus Mundus network, or the UMN built by Vector, is housing the Gnosis for unknown reasons. Due to this, Shion leaves Vector and joins a group called Scientia to discover what the deal with the UMN is, and maybe even how to deal with the Gnosis attacks that have been getting more and more frequent. All the while, Udu is still a looming threat, and a mysterious group called the Testaments are watching Shion and Cosmos for unknown reasons, and this strange child named Abel looks like Faye from Xenogears. That last bit isn't really relevant to anything, it just caught me off guard when I first saw it, and I needed to share that with you. Also, the name of this hotel makes me a little bit uncomfortable having played Xenoblade 3. So the general setup is obviously very interesting for me, but without getting too ahead of myself, I knew I would love Episode 3 just from the first few hours. This is probably just because I'm coming hot off the heels of Episode 2, but one reason is its presentation, because it's easily the best in the series. That being said though, I'm not exactly crazy about the 2 black bars they have at the top and bottom for cinematic cutscenes. It just takes up way too much space for me. Gameplay was also a very welcome improvement over the last game, because Episode 3 definitely has my favorite combat in the series, especially with the mech combat. Xenosaga Episode 3 is a very different beast compared to both 1 and 2. The button combos are gone, with them being replaced by a simple attack button. Tech attacks are also back, but they also work differently here too, with them being their own list of selectable attacks. Completely new to 3 though is the break gauge for both enemies and your party members. When it's filled, an enemy or character will be down and out for 2 turns, and they'll also take more damage. In order to inflict break though, you'll need to use specific attacks that you can get through both level up and this game's method for learning new abilities. Here, characters learn new skills via the skill line, a fairly linear skill tree with 2 branching paths and a few EX skill nodes you can unlock throughout the game. I don't know if I like that it's split into 2 straight branches, but as a whole I like this a lot more than what Episode 2 did, and the EX skill nodes do make up for it a bit. Boosting also returns, with it working the same way it did in Episode 2, but new to this is the special attacks. These are hard-hitting attacks that use the boost gauge instead of EP, and honestly, I used these way more than the actual boost mechanic. See, when you finish off an enemy with a special attack, you get a bonus at the end of battle that increases how much experience and skill points you earn as well as money, and this was oddly addicting. Like, I don't even fully understand why, I just found myself kind of obsessed with trying to get at least 1 finish strike per fight because it just felt super satisfying to do. Honestly, this one thing by itself left me fully engaged with every fight I was ever in. Frankly, the ground combat in Episode 3 was just really good as a whole, with the finish strikes and break gauges being fun to keep track of. As for party members though, just like in the first game, Cosmos was easily my favorite character to use. Aside from just how cool she is, Cosmos hits like a truck and has some great tech attacks for dealing with basically everything. Ziggy I love for one specific attack he has. See, eventually you can unlock Choke for him, a break attack that's way more brutal than I was ever expecting. I will say though, this attack does look a bit, awkward in the boss fight with Mai. One really cool new addition to the game is the ability to buy your own traps, so you can immobilize enemies for an extra boost to your boost gauge. Traps have been in every game, and an improvement on the idea like this was something I was really wanting to see since episode 1, and I'm glad it's here because it's super satisfying to use. As for the mech combat though, I'm happy to say they've finally got it down. In episode 1 they were kinda hard to use. In episode 2 they worked much better, but looking back they aren't used much and there wasn't a lot of customization to make them interesting. In 3 though, none of these problems are present, and the actual gameplay is very different from the last 2 games. Here, each mech has a set amount of energy it can use each turn, and the higher energy you have, the more attacks you can use. Depending on what attacks you string together, though, you can also get a chance for another team member or two to jump in for an extra attack, which is useful for helping charge Episode 3's new mechanic for mech combat. This time around, the gang has ES mechs equipped with an anima gauge. When charged, this allows you to use a hard-hitting special attack, and at higher anima levels, you even get a few turns with reduced energy costs for attacks. Similarly to ground combat, you can also use traps for bonuses, and you can even get finishing strikes using the special attacks. My favorite thing to do was to get all 3 characters' anima gauge to level 2, so I can AoE a group of 5 to 6 guys in a few seconds. It doesn't greatly increase the finishing bonus, but it does feel satisfying. As a whole, I really enjoy Episode 3's gameplay. It feels really good and is easily the best in the series, and while it doesn't surpass Chained Echo's Sky Armors, the ESs were great. Finally though, I actually have enough to say about the story to justify a spoiler section, so skip to here if you want to avoid that. I won't be talking about everything, but at the very least I need to go to bat for why Shion, despite her likability, is a good character, and why I like the game's villains and how one of them connects back to a main villain from Xenoblade 3. It's really only towards the end of this next chapter that I talk about them, but if you don't want to run the risk of spoiling yourself for Xenoblade 3 by connecting a few dots, I'd also recommend skipping ahead. With that being said, let's get into it. So before I begin, I just want to say that overall, I did enjoy Xenosaga's story. It's not perfect, and it definitely could have used the full 6 games, but for what it managed to accomplish with just 3 games, I did enjoy it. That being said though, let's talk about Shion. From what I've heard, she's kinda divisive as a protagonist, and I can see why. She isn't always the most likable person for a lot of reasons. However, I don't feel you need to be completely likable to be a good character, and being hard to like doesn't automatically mean you're badly written. While I won't excuse her actions in any way, as she should be called out for her behavior, it's pretty clear to me that Shion is the way she is due to her past. Shion's lost a lot of important people to her in some very brutal ways that she had to bear witness to. Feb was both beaten and eaten alive by crazed Realians, her father was stabbed through the chest, her mom suffered a very similar fate, and all of these were on the same day when she was like 8. To be honest, Shion reminds me a lot of an important family member of mine. They're stubborn, can be kinda pushy, and even hard to talk to or reason with, and sometimes they can be frustratingly impulsive. The difference here is while both sides have their faults due to trauma, Shion is still pretty young, seemingly unaware of her problems, and is in desperate need of therapy if she hasn't had it already. The person I know has had the better part of like 30 years to process their traumas and is fully aware of their issues, and is trying their best to be better about them even if it's really difficult. Like I said before, my point isn't to say that you shouldn't dislike Shion's personality because of her issues. It's fine if you do. My point is that just because a character has dislikable qualities doesn't mean they're poorly written. With a character like Shion, it's better to try and understand why she is the way she is, rather than just accept her as dislikable and that there's nothing more to her. Moving on to some of the game's main villains, the Testaments though, I really liked them overall. They're not exactly perfect, and the one Testament that's the hardest to like as a character is Voyager, because he unfortunately requires knowledge from Pied Piper to really understand. Having the knowledge I do though, I find Voyager to be an irredeemable monster. His original personality, Eric, on the other hand, I do feel bad for since, as far as I understand it, the poor guy is more a victim of circumstance than anything. We didn't see much of them over the course of Xenosaga before 3, so I was a little nervous about how well utilized they would be. Thankfully though, I was worried for nothing because they were actually utilized fairly well. The Testaments get just the right amount of focus for me to grow attached to them as villains, and even characters. Albedo's had 3 entire games for me to grow attached to him, so let's talk about Virgil and Kevin instead. In the first game, Virgil was just some guy who was racist towards Realians for some reason, and had a general distaste for humans, but here in the Memory of Miltia, we learn exactly why. We get probably about only an hour in terms of cutscenes with past Virgil, but in that it's shown pretty strongly where these feelings come from and that there's far more to them than we thought during the final scenes at the church. Virgil may not be the greatest guy around, but this arc did a lot to make me understand and really like his character. And then there's Kevin. Kevin is an incredibly important person for Shion, since he was both her ex-boyfriend and the initial designer for Cosmos. So by episode 3, when we learn that he's not only still alive as a testament, but he was also using Shion for the eternal recurrence as an emotionally manipulative, abusive boyfriend without her realizing it, that all leaves a very big impact. Seriously though, on its own, this is morally reprehensible, but as we've discussed earlier, Shion's a trauma victim, and is probably suffering from some major mental disorders like PTSD, which frankly makes Kevin's manipulation even more disgusting. Respect to Alan in this scene, by the way. I didn't think much of him before this, but he proved himself to be a real Chad here. Everyone watching this should be more like him. He's great. That being said though, as far as the Testament's boss Wilhelm goes, I gotta say, he made me realize that Xenoblade 3's main villain Z is just a worse version of him. You see, one of Z's biggest problems was that he didn't do much of anything. He could have easily killed the protagonists at any point he wanted to, either through his own power or by sending a ton of Mobius, but he never does. Because of this, Z becomes a pretty boring villain. Wilhelm, however, doesn't have this problem. Like Z, Wilhelm is also a sort of living concept, but the difference between them is that Wilhelm's writing fits this idea better, and he actually does things even if they're off-screen. He's a puppet master that's been manipulating every side for who knows how long in order to constantly achieve eternal recurrence. Z's characterization, despite being the living embodiment of the fears and desires of those aboard Origin, can be boiled down to him loving people suffering, and he's scared of the thought Origin might not work and reboot reality. Meanwhile, while Wilhelm also enjoys human suffering and isn't a good person, his motivations are seemingly completely altruistic as the guardian of the lower domain, since the recurrence completely resets him too, and he hasn't found another way to keep reality from collapsing besides that. Compared to Z, Wilhelm is just a way better version of this idea, and honestly, this makes me dislike 3's villains even more now that I've seen more potential for how good they could have been. Let's go back to a question I asked at the start of this video. Was Xenosaga Episode 3 more satisfying as a conclusion for me than Xenoblade 3? Absolutely yes. Don't get me wrong here, Xenoblade 3 isn't bad by any means. I can completely understand why so many people love it, and I'm really happy that they find it as wonderful as they do. For me though, looking back on it, the game really wasn't my thing, where Xenosaga 3 definitely was. The series has had its ups and downs, and while it definitely could have used those extra 3 games to reach its full potential, I did really enjoy my time with this trilogy. I can see why it's not talked about as much compared to Xenogears and Xenoblade though. Episode 3's gameplay is great, but Episode 1 and 2's gameplay won't be for everyone, which can make for a kinda rough start and an especially rough middle for many. For me though, I really enjoyed the story as a whole, and I grew to really like the cast and lore for Xenosaga. With any luck, maybe these games can get ports or remakes someday, because honestly, I really feel they deserve the chance to shine in the public eye like the modern Xenoblades do. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.